with us, David Goodrich. He is from the Rockville area, retired from NOAA, and he told me that he has studied the Chesapeake Bay from end to end. So we should have been asking him to talk about that too. I'd love him to talk to him about that. But because he was on a bicycle trip across the United States and happened into a small museum in where? Iowa?
Vandalia, Illinois.
Illinois, and learned about the Underground Railroad that had happened through that particular town, got him interested in studying the Underground Railroad. So, and his wife is a retired Montgomery County librarian. So we're happy to have both of them. David? Oh, yes.
Thanks very much to Ellie and Adele and Mike for the very kind Mount Airy hospitality for this evening. It's kind of like coming back for me, because the bike that I used on this ride came from the Mount Airy bike shop. He does one of his specialties is tandems and touring bikes, the big heavy bikes, and that's what I used. It was need to carry a lot of bags to get over about 3,000 miles. So yeah, the book and the project, I was basically writing, trying to follow routes of the Underground Railroad, both in the West, on basically the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and in the East, following Harriet Tubman's route from Cambridge, Maryland to Ontario. So I want to, in the spirit of ghost stories, want to tell a few ghost stories of some folks that I met along the way on these rides. One's from Maryland and DC, two young ladies from Maryland and DC, and one's from not so far away from Harper's Ferry. But first, a few notes on this strange enterprise of bicycle touring. Ellie mentioned that I worked for NOAA, and I was on a ship for 4 years. And one of the things on a ship, when you've been out to sea for a while and you're looking forwards to coming back to port, you've been beat around a little bit, and you're looking for that landfall, that first sighting of land. And more often than not, what you see coming over the horizon is a lighthouse. It'll be the first thing coming over the curve of the earth. And riding bike out on the prairie, there's a similar kind of thing that happens. Prairie, their towns are pretty well spaced out. You can go 20, 30 miles between towns. And you know, you've been out in the wind for a while, you're really looking forward to that coffee shop or that lunch. And the thing you see coming over the horizon is the same thing that you have here in Mount Airy, a water tank. Comes out of the earth, and it's like, okay, there's the town, I'm here. And one of those towns, as Ellie was mentioning, was Vandalia, Illinois. And they have a small historical museum there that just had all kinds of stuff in it there. And I was just looking for a place out of the wind. I was right on my way riding across to Oregon, and had a really hard day. It's like, okay, I just need someplace out of the wind. And the woman who was there said, would you like to see, you know, some of our artifacts? I said, oh, absolutely. She handed me this heavy brass ring. She says, do you know what this is? No. She said, this is a slave collar. And I go, oh, okay. And she was telling me about how Vandalia used to be one of the many routes of the Underground Railroad. In Vandalia's case, literally a railroad. And in the back of my mind, it was like, okay, I want to come back to that. And it also tied into something from from a trip a long time ago to the other side of the Atlantic. My family, the Goodrich family, originally comes from the border with Wales. There is a Goodrich Castle, which is definitely a fixer-upper. And so we were wandering around town, and there was the Museum of the Commonwealth in Bristol. Bristol is a notable seafaring town, and they had an exhibit there of a particular captain named John Goodrich, and the exhibit was about his role on the Middle Passage. He was a captain on the brig Sarah that made multiple trips to West Africa, bringing the enslaved from West Africa, in the case they documented, to Jamaica. That they kept very good records. They picked up 258 in West Africa, and only 161 made it to Jamaica. And it sort of struck me in this process of doing this, you need to have a little bit of humility in looking at your ancestors. That we, in one way or another, we've all got a piece of this grand enterprise of slavery, and your ancestors might be involved in a way that you hadn't anticipated. We all like to think that maybe they were helping enslaved people on their way north, and many did, but in my case, it was sort of like, okay. Now, so a couple of things about the rides. This is a photograph that my wife Connie took of three of us. Most of the time on the rides, I was with one or the other of these folks. My friend Rick Sullivan, who's a blues guitarist and a retired psychologist, and the woman that I used to ride with, Lynn Salvo, like last week completed a ride coast to coast, becoming the Guinness record oldest woman to ride across the U.S. So I've been in some fairly distinguished company. This was a photograph taken outside Cambridge, Maryland, and with at this point, we were very fortunate to have Connie acting as supporting us with supporting gear riding. So we didn't have too much in the way of bags, but once she left, we were basically carrying our gear along with us. So the routes that I was taking, about a third of the time I was riding solo, and in the other times it was with some combination of Rick or Lynn or my friend Jan from upstate New York. Three basic rides. There was this one coming up from New Orleans into the Mississippi Delta. I called it the Highway 61 Revisited. Highway 61 is known as the Blues Highway, and that title was actually a Bob Dylan album, Once Upon a Time. The longest of the routes started in Jackson, Mississippi, goes up through Tennessee, Kentucky, along the Ohio River, and through Ohio, ultimately ending at Lake Erie in a town of northeast Pennsylvania. That was about 1,500 miles. And then the last one was starting at where Harriet Tubman was born, where she was enslaved, in Cambridge, Maryland, and following her route up through Philadelphia, New York City, the Hudson, and then roughly along the Erie Canalway in upstate New York to a little chapel in Ontario, Salem Chapel, where in the 1850s, where she could be free. The general logistics on the road, I typically ride about 60 miles a day. I would I camped at times, but on these rides, I was in motels, though not necessarily the fanciest varieties. we had one in this, there's a town right around here called Iuka, Mississippi, where the owner opened the door to a room. It's like, okay, there's a hole in the wall, there's stains on the quilt, and the floor is kind of gritty. I say, oh, this will be fine. And later Rick says, I don't mean to criticize your standards, I just haven't been able to detect any. So anyway, not necessarily the finest of camping, but one of the benefits in looking at Underground Railroad is that you are out in the weather on a bike. You're in some ways you're feeling some of the things that the people who were on the run felt. Now this is all with benefit of nice shiny gears, of assured shelter for the night, Gore-Tex, and the fact that we're actually riding during the daytime. Most of the people on the Underground Railroad are at night and being chased. There is somebody after them, almost regardless of where you are. I mean, we think of the pre-Civil War era as, having the Ohio River here and the Mason-Dixon line is sort of the boundary between the free and slave states. Truth is, after 1850, there's no place in the U.S. that the slave hunters cannot nab you and bring you back. The bounty hunting was a very big business. And one of the things that was actually on the cover to the book, actually, go back here for 1 second. Goes better here. There's one of the roads that I was riding on. It's a beautiful road through Mississippi and Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, called the Natchez Trace Parkway. And it's a beautiful road, and some places alongside the road, there are patches of the original trace. They call it the old trace. And on the cover, this is a piece of the old trace. It's like a V going through the forest. And it took me a while to realize this is one of those places where history is imprinted on the land. I mean, you can go out west on the Oregon Trail, parts of the Oregon Trail, and you can still see wagon ruts. Here, took me a while to realize this, but this V was primarily generated by chained feet. The Natchez Trace was a major route from the upper South, where enslaved people were sold basically between 1810 to 1860. Many of those slave pens are right in Alexandria, or were right in Alexandria. And the Natchez Trace was one of the main routes where the enslaved would go to the big markets at Natchez and at New Orleans. So it was kind of right there. One of the you run across some places on the way. This was one of the really vivid places. This is in Dover, Delaware. There is an AME, African Methodist Episcopal Black Church, in Dover called Star Hill, documented as definitely a stop on the Underground Railroad. But I couldn't get in touch with the pastor. And they have a Facebook page. The phones that I just could not get in touch with them. And it turned out that we were riding on a Sunday morning, and I just thought, why don't we just stop it? And so we showed up, and we're hearing, we're hearing music, we're hearing singing from inside. There's a service going on, and we kind of go up, and there was a woman at the door. We explained to them we were following Harriet Tubman's route, and they said, please come in. And we were trying to sit there inconspicuously in the back of the three white, sweaty people. There are people kind of going like this, and two women in the middle of this. very much of a call and response service that happens at the AME churches. And two women leave, they both have white gloves on, and they come back with bottles of ice water for us. And later, it was Father's Day. They had these envelopes for Father's Day that they gave to us. And I was able to go back, this is like my favorite picture from the whole enterprise. I was able to go back like 2 months later, or 2 months ago. And these were the two women who brought us the ice water, Sandra and Hattie at Star Hill. It was a wonderful day. In the category of ghost stories, maybe ghost story number 1 with the Maryland connection comes with this old photograph, a daguerreotype from 1850, from upstate New York, town of Cazenovia. I stopped through this town on the way out, and the nearby town, Peterborough, is where the National Abolition Hall of Fame is. And this daguerreotype has a few famous faces in it. The gentleman who has his arm outstretched here, this is Garrett Smith, who was one of the richest men in the country at the time, and he was basically the financier for John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid. They referred to the people in charge of that as the Secret Six. He was probably the wealthiest of the Secret Six. This was a convention that he put on against the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. This was a law that basically said it doesn't matter where people on the enslaved are on the run, you can nab them anywhere they go. And the slave hunters went pretty much everywhere in the States. And this was to push back against this law. This was part of the Compromise of 1850. But with Garrett Smith, even more famous face is Frederick Douglass, who at the time was running the North Star abolitionist newspaper out of Rochester, New York. But there are also the faces of two girls, 15 and 17 at the top, Emily and Mary Edmondson, two sisters, who are actually from right around here. The Edmondson sisters were enslaved about 3 miles from my house. They were in Silver Spring, Maryland, at the what's now the Leisure World in Silver Spring, and they were working as slaves in Washington when they were part of this amazing conspiracy. On Saturday night, about 70 of the enslaved left in the middle of the night for the waterfront, where there was a ship called the Pearl that left that night out of Washington was run by abolitionists and was a way to escape, make their break for freedom. The Pearl was a sailing ship, and it was becalmed at the mouth of the Potomac. And by the next day, they had a steam boat that came, captured the Pearl, towed it back to Washington, basically paraded all of the people who were on the ship through the city of Washington, and then they were immediately sold south. They all ended up down in New Orleans, including the two Edmondson sisters. But their father, who was free, basically managed to talk with other abolitionists in town, including one from a congressman from Ohio. And the fate of the Edmondson sisters became this cause célèbre in the abolitionist community. And they raised enough money to buy their freedom. And when this picture was taken, they had just been freed and had gone up to this convention. They were the star attractions at the Anti-Fugitive Slave Law Convention in Cazenovia, and indeed Emily sang at the convention. Her sister Mary unfortunately died of tuberculosis about a year after this photograph was taken. But Emily, after the Civil War, she comes down to Washington, D.C., and is one of the founding instructors in the Minor School for Colored Girls, to provide education for the newly freed. And the Minor School for Colored Girls ultimately becomes DC Teachers College, which becomes the University of the District of Columbia. And Emily Edmondson and Frederick Douglass are friends for life after this photograph was taken. They both die in the same year, in 1895. And if you go wandering around the streets of Alexandria, you can find the Edmondson sisters. This is a statue right in the middle of nice tall steel office buildings on the site of the slave pen where they were held. And if you look at the back of the statue, there's into the brass of the back of the statue is a little engraving of a ship, the Pearl. So I've always, they have always been almost feel like they're friends of mine by now. Ghost story number 2. Louis Leary is a free black man, lives in Oberlin, Ohio. I stumbled upon his path, was riding through, north through Ohio to Oberlin, which is where Oberlin College is. My friend Jan had a fall, cracked his helmet, so he wasn't doing very well. I'd had a fever for about 5 days riding through Ohio, and it's like we both could use a day off. So we wandered around Ohio, and there is a monument to John Brown's Raiders, and one of the raiders was this man, was Louis Leary. He was recruited by John Brown to come to Harper's Ferry, and probably didn't quite realize what he was getting in for. On the first night of the Harper's Ferry raid, he's one of 3 who take over the rifle works at Harper's Ferry. By the morning, the place is swarming with Virginia militia. Louis Leary meets his end here. He's shot on the Shenandoah River. He's trying to escape across the very shallow Shenandoah River. He's shot and killed here at Harper's Ferry. But his story doesn't end. He, with him, the abolitionists gave him a blanket shawl, and the shawl makes its way back to his widow in Oberlin. And Mary Patterson, actually I have a certain reading on this. Let me show you the shawl, because the shawl still exists. This is at the Ohio Historical Society. So let me tell you a little bit about the shawl. The shawl rests today at the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus. When we arranged to see the shawl, I imagined entering a great glass and steel museum. Instead, we pulled up to a windowless prefab building in an industrial park, the sort of place where one would expect to find the remains of Roswell UFOs. We gently rang the doorbell. The steel door swung open, and Rebecca Odom, the curator, escorted me to a broad, flat table with a large cardboard tube. She put on latex gloves and gently unrolled one of the most treasured objects in our collection. The blanket shawl is a large, tattered piece of brown wool with blue stripes. It has holes from moss and holes from wear along the folds. But if objects can have power, the shawl does. The baby that Mary Patterson wrapped in the shawl, this is after his widow became a grandmother, had remarried. She is raising her grandson. The baby that Mary Patterson wrapped in the shawl grew to be a young vagabond traveling from city to city, even crewing on a tramp steamer to Africa. He worked as a busboy at a Washington hotel before his poems gained recognition. Langston Hughes would become the great poet of the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote of rivers and jazzmen, of weary blues and dreams deferred. And it's like Langston Hughes was the one who donated the shawl to the Ohio Museum. And it was always, it's kind of like, oh, so it was like his spirit of Louis Leary was passed on to the next century. So one of the things about lately that Black history has been a lot of news of late. We've seen where the AP Black History course was canceled in Florida. There are laws on the books in Tennessee and Texas that prohibit teaching where students are made to feel discomfort because of one's race. And this is something that's not really new. W. Du Bois, back in 1935, he has a quote. He says, "One is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, skimmed over." I was particularly drawn to another quote by Brian Stevenson, who's the man, you might have seen, there was a movie called Just Mercy. I think that's still on Netflix. He's the man who founded the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama, and the Legacy Museum there. And one of his quotes says, "I think it's important that we understand all the brutal, all the ugly details, because those are the things that might allow us one day to lay claim to something really beautiful." And that kind of stuck in the back of my head. It's like, what's he mean by something really beautiful? And it occurred to me I had stumbled on something like that. I present to you a little picture on a wall in an Underground Railroad house that I visited in Albany, New York. These are ossuaries. What's an ossuary? That is a box for bones. And when I stopped there, I asked the curator, Paul Stewart, I said, what's with these pictures on the wall? He says, well, there's a story there. He said, in 2005, while doing some utility work around Albany, a place called Schuyler Flats, they come across the remains, 14 sets of remains. It soon becomes very obvious that these were enslaved people. And suddenly it's, what do we do? How can we honor these people? How can we treat them with respect? We don't know their names. We do know that they were enslaved either by or in the neighborhood of the General Schuyler, who was a Revolutionary War general out of Albany. And what they ended up doing took them about 10 years to figure out what to do. And what they ended up doing was, we want to have a reburial. And they put out a call to woodworkers, artists, artisans, third grade students, said, we want you to design the ossuaries that we will put these, that we will reinter these bones. In the meantime, they also reconstructed one of the faces of the women who they found, and it's like, this is somebody who could live down the street. And they were reburied. The reburial ceremony took place in the Schuyler Mansion. If any of you have seen Hamilton, the Schuyler Mansion is where Alexander Hamilton and Eliza are married. And this is in the next room. And I wanna close by a picture, which is sort of, this goes, is at the end of the book as well. This one. This is Daniel Hogan was one of the woodworkers that made the box that is the ossuary that's to his left. Evelyn King was the chair of the reburial committee in Albany that figured out what's the right thing to do. From the book, I can't pretend to know what reconciliation looks like, but a string of voices through history to today, from Du Bois to Baldwin to Stevenson, tells us that we can't keep reburying our past. National trauma, like a wound, tends to heal when it's exposed to the air. For me, that road began at a rural museum in Illinois. Maybe part of the answer was in code, up on the wall at the Myers residence in Albany, those boxes. A tall copper sculpture with African symbols, homage to the 14 lost and rediscovered. 14 photos of beautiful, intricate wooden boxes, all deep in the ground now. And the photo of a small black woman with a huge tattooed white man, both deep in thought next to one of the ossuary boxes. Perhaps I read too much into a woman's image, but something in this photograph speaks to me of grace and hope and reconciliation. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I appreciate it.